Good morning, everybody. This is Maria Brindelmeyer. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist for Youth Power Learning at Making Sense International. And for those of you who are new to Youth Power Learning, this Youth Power Learning is a 5-year USAID-funded program focused on positive youth development. And I'll just give a little introduction about positive youth development. But before that, also just want to say we're very excited to be listening today to our two guest speakers who are going to present the independent progress study on youth, peace, and security called The Missing Piece. We are looking forward to their presentation and your discussions. So just a brief introduction about positive youth development for those of you who are new to this. The way that USAID and Youth Power Learning has defined positive youth development is that it is a program that recognizes the youth's inherent rights and result in youth who have assets. So basically giving youth assets, which could be skills, for example, giving them the ability to leverage those assets, so giving them agency, providing them with the ability to contribute to positive change for themselves, so the contribution aspect, and then surrounding them with an enabling environment. So it's those four kind of attributes: assets, agency, contribution, and the enabling environment that we use to define positive youth development. And then just kind of some brief introduction of the activities that Youth Power Learning is doing, and also how you can get involved with Youth Power Learning. We have this website, youthpower.org, where you can find lots of resources, especially also about youth and peace and security. We have a whole What Works section on youth and peace and security. You can also leverage the tools like measuring positive youth development, which is a really useful toolkit. Forthcoming is that you can all contribute to the new learning agenda that we're developing as part of the Youth Power Learning activities. And of course, you can engage with the communities of practice just like today. So with that, brief introduction. Let me introduce our two speakers. Cécile Mazzacurati heads the Joint UN Population Fund, the Peace Building Support Office Secretariat that supports the development of the progress study, and is also the co-chair on behalf of the PBSO of the Interagency Working Group on Youth and Peace Building. And we also have Noëlla, who leads the United Nations Development Program's youth portfolio in the Bureau for Policy and Program Support, Governance and Peace Building cluster, and manages UNDP's Youth Global Program for Sustainable Development and Peace. She's also the co-chair of the Interagency Working Group on Youth and the Sustainable Development Goals, and represents UNDP in the Working Group on Young People's Participation in Peace Building and the Steering Committee for the Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security. So very illustrious speakers. We're delighted to have you. And with that, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Cécile, and Noëlla and I are based in New York, and sending you greetings from a summer in New York this morning. And we're very happy to have the opportunity to be presenting briefly to you the progress study on youth, peace, and security. So I will start, and then Noëlla will cover the second part of the presentation, and we hope to still have a good half hour after that for questions and comments and reactions from everyone. Let me just check that everyone can hear me well.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll just start with a little bit of background on the progress study. So the study was mandated by Security Council Resolution 2250 that I assume everyone is familiar with in this group. It's of course the first resolution of the Council that was fully dedicated to the positive role that young people play in relation to peace and security. So the resolution was adopted at the end of 2015, and it mandated the Secretary General of the UN to carry out a study on young people's contribution to peace processes and conflict resolution, specifically asking for recommendations at local, national, regional, and international levels. It is a way to proceed that is actually quite often used for the UN and for Security Council resolutions. So for instance, Resolution 1325 that I assume most of you know on women, peace and security, when it was adopted in 2000, it also mandated the Secretary General to do a study. And this led to the report called Women, War and Peace in 2002. There's also the Grassa-Machel report on children and armed conflict, which actually led to the adoption of Resolution 1612 on the question of protecting children from violence and armed conflict. So this is often a request from the Council, or that leads to a resolution of the Council, to have a report that gives the state of play and an overview of the field. And because this was the very first study on youth, peace and security, the Secretary General decided that it should be an independent study. So it's very different in nature and content from the global study on 1325 that some of you might be familiar with, which was published just a few years ago on the 15th anniversary of 1325, which was assessing progress in the implementation of the resolution. Here again, the idea is just to give it's more of a starting point study, even though it was called a progress study, which was a decision of the Council. So as I said, it was decided that it would be an independent study supported by the United Nations system. So the Secretary General appointed Graham Simpson as the main author. Graham is the US Director of the International Peacebuilding NGO Interpeace. So he's the main author for the study, and the Secretary General also appointed a group of 21 advisors, all independent, half of them young people and half of them women. And I'm stressing that in particular because we know that these types of high-level panels are often quite imbalanced in terms of gender and age representation. So it was very much a principle from the start that young people should be at the heart of making the study. So we have this group of really amazing experts and young people and practitioners who were really key drivers in developing the content of the study. And we also had a steering committee that included 34 different organizations from the UN system, NGOs, etc. Noëlla is my partner in crime on the UNDP side. I see in the chat box that we have Ludmila from UNOI. UNOI was also a key partner in the steering committee and in the making of the study. So it was a very participatory process. So starting by the end, we now have just released the Security Council version of the study. It was discussed in an open debate of the Security Council just last week, and Noëlla will talk about this a little bit later. So we call this the short version of the study. Any document that is presented to the Security Council has to follow very specific rules in terms of its length and number of words, and so it could only be 20 pages. Which is why we will also have a full version of the study, which will be around 120 pages that will be released after the summer for the General Assembly. So in a way, you have really the political document, which is the version that is out now, widely available on the web, and that we can, of course, circulate if you've not seen it. And again, you'll have the full version that will have much more concrete examples and voices of young people that will also be, in a way, be more academic. And we'll also have an interactive version that will soon be online. So for the research process, at the very core of the process was the importance to work directly with young people, to consult directly young people, so that the study would really be the opportunity to carry their voices and their vision to the Security Council. So we define, and when I say we, again, it's the lead author and the advisors with the support. So my role was to support as the secretariat, but to help to design this a participatory research process. So we consulted over 4,000 young people through regional consultations that took place in all regions that were organized in partnership with UNDP, UNFP, and other UN partners. And we also had many focus group discussions that were organized through civil society partners, recognizing that on the UN side, when we do regional consultations or even of a national level consultations, we tend to have access to young people who are more from a privileged background. For regional consultations, definitely young people who can travel, have a passport, speak English or French, etc. But we wanted to make sure we also involved, very importantly, young people who are not generally participating in this type of policy processes. So we put in place partnerships with a number of civil society organizations, Search for Common Ground, Conciliation Resources, Safer World, Interpeace, and others, so that they could do focus group discussions in many different countries, from Yemen to Afghanistan, but also Sweden and the UK, because we really wanted to hear from young people in all regions. We also had a regional consultation in Europe, a national consultation in Canada, because the thinking from the very beginning is that the youth, peace and security agenda is directly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and to Agenda 2030, and that this is not just an agenda of post-conflict countries. We also had our partners from the United Network of Young Peace Builders and Search for Common Ground do a mapping of youth-led civil society organizations, and many different partners did country-focused research, thematic papers, etc. Most of these documents are available online on the Youth for Peace website. We've released everything that we could to make this available to the community of people working and interested in youth, peace, and security issues. So I'm now going to give you an overview of the main messages and finding of the study. The study has 4 main parts, and the first one is around tackling stereotypes and polyphemus associated to young people in relation to peace and security. Starting by just the simple data that 408 million young people live in conflicts that are affected by armed conflict and organized violence, which is about 1 in 4 young people. Sorry, someone just walked in. The youth, peace and security agendas, as I already mentioned, we see it very directly connected to the 2030 agenda, but also very importantly to the women, peace and security agenda, which I already mentioned very much. Its complement in terms of how we're stressing on the inclusivity of peace building. It's also very much connected to the human rights framework, and of course, very importantly, to the sustaining peace agenda, particularly in its more recent thinking on the UN side, with a very strong focus on conflict prevention. So what the study demonstrates in this first part is that there are widespread stereotypes which associate young people to violence, and particularly young men, and that this is extremely detrimental to policy and programmatic investments in young people, when in reality, the vast majority of young people are not involved in violence or not in danger of participating in violence. And this is very much a gendered perception of young people, where young men tend to be seen as a threat and young women tend to be seen as victims in a very passive role. There are 3 main areas that are related, 3 main areas of misconception. The question of youth bulges and how growing youth population would be presenting a threat of violence. Young migrants, refugees, and internally displaced young people also seen as a threat to the societies that welcome them, and a challenge, being challenged at integrating, and also the association between young people, often young men, but more and more young women, with violent extremist groups. And these different areas of misconception that have existed, of course, throughout decades, but have also taken a more recent incarnation post 9/11, and with the migrant crisis in recent years, have triggered what the author called a policy panic, which is a panic around young people, which, as I said, is fueling counterproductive investment in young people, where it's very much hard security approaches that are aiming at containing young people rather than investing in them. The second section of the study then goes into demonstrating that actually a lot of young people are contributing to peace and security, but that this work tends to be not recognized, not invested in, excuse me, and not well known at all. And here I want to highlight the survey that was done by UNDP and Search for Common Ground, mapping youth-led peace-building organization that gives really interesting insights about this organization works. The fact that so out of the 400 respondent organizations, half of them are functioning with a budget of less than $5,000 per year. They rely at 98% on volunteers, and really give an interesting insight of the work of the work that young people do. Also showing that the contribution of young people to peace take a lot of different forms. So there are many youth-led organizations working at the local level. So again, the UNDP Search for Common Ground really gives an interesting picture of that. And it goes all the way to well-established organizations that are working with international actors, government, etc. This section also describes how young people work at different phases of the peace and conflict cycles, that they're involved in conflict prevention, they're involved in humanitarian response, they're involved in post-conflict work, and that they engage with many different types of violence. So it's not just conflict, but it's also working to take young people out of gangs, sexual and gender-based violence, violent extremism, etc. One thing that the study highlights that I think is very important is to also recognize that young people's leadership is not just found in youth-led organizations. It's also found in many other organizations, other civil society organizations that really are focused on and giving space to young people leadership, and so recognizing the variety of young people's involvement for peace and not just seeing it as incarnated in youth-led civil society organizations is important. And this section ends by talking about young people's peaceful protests and the fact that the way young people contribute to social change and political change is not also not limited to organization. It's also more amorphous movement, and it's young people going into the street and calling for change, just like we see right now, for instance, in the US around gun violence, etc., and the importance for states to respect that space and to respect that agency by young people, because this is how historical processes unfold. The next section is around addressing the violence of exclusion, something that young people spoke very strongly about in absolutely all of our research, in all countries, in all regions, in developing countries, in the global north. about the feelings of exclusion, the feelings of not being recognized, and the profound mistrust towards their government and societies. So this section talks about the different forms that this violence of exclusion take, and give some pointers towards how how things could be changed. There's a discussion around young people's participation in peace processes, really showing how historically their participation in peace processes, formal peace processes, has been very limited, and actually quite important more in informal peace processes. There's a discussion around political participation and the importance to ensure broad representation of young people, the danger of manipulation and control by political parties, and the importance of facilitating young people's participation in representational politics, including by lowering the age for eligibility. This chapter also looks at the question of economic well-being and livelihoods, which are, of course, very big issues related to peace and security. But the important point here is that, contrary to something that we still hear very much, there is no association between youth unemployment and violent conflict. And we tend to see unemployed youth as a threat to peace and security, when actually research shows that the triggers that push young people to turn to violence are much more complex than that, and primarily related to a strong sense of injustice, horizontal inequality, and that therefore the approaches of employment for peace building as a way to mitigate young people's quote-unquote tendency to turn to violent groups is not the right solution to a problem that's not been well identified. Which, of course, is not to say that employment is not important for young people, but just to understand better the dynamics here. Education was a really core issue discussed by young people throughout all of the consultations we did and all of the research. It is at the very center of what young people want, and it's not just wanting to receive good quality education, but wanting to have educational systems that promote peace and tolerance and understanding between groups. And a lot of young people spoke very beautifully about how important it was for their societies. I've talked about gender already, so I'll skip that. And a last point around protection and human rights, also something that came up very consistently in absolutely all contexts, how young people are not only, of course, victimized by conflict, but also how in their peace building work they are harassed, they are threatened, they are at danger, and so the importance to protect their space and to see them also as actors of protection and recognize their human rights role. This is my last slide before I turn it to Noëlla. So all this takes us to recognizing that young people can represent a peace dividend if the right investments are in place, if their peace building work is recognized and nurtured. And for that, it requires what, again, the lead author called a seismic shift, meaning that governments, the multilateral system, really need to reorient their policy and programming towards young people using Resolution 2250 as the basis, because it is the policy framework that has been established by member states. So the importance to really prioritize prevention rather than hard security responses, the importance to recognize the resilience of young people, and the importance to put in place partnerships that are based on trust, and that and really working hand in hand in organizations led by and focused by young people. And I'll turn it over to Noëlla.
Thank you, Cécile. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. So to translate this youth demographic dividend into a peace dividend that Cécile just mentioned, indeed some major shifts, some seismic shifts, as the lead author called them, are required. And the study provides a series of recommendations that propose important stepping stones to achieve that. So 3 broad areas are covered in this recommendation. The first one that you see on this slide. First, a set of proposals for investing in the capacities, agency, and leadership of youth. That means that, there is a very interesting financial target in particular being presented in the study. Member states, donors, international financial institutions, and other international organizations should allocate 1.8 billion by 2025 for the 10th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 2250. This is approximately $1 per young person. The idea is also to provide, the recommendation at least, is to provide flexible funding designed with the specific needs of young people in mind, creating dedicated youth peace and security windows under existing funds, for instance, prioritizing as part of any funding support to youth organizations the building of capacities to increase their financial sustainability, as we know that for many youth grassroots organizations, that has been a major bottleneck in accessing funding. Another proposal in that context is to support the establishment or the strengthening of national, regional, and global youth peace networks, offline and online, for young people and their organizations. Now, moving on to the following slide, the second recommendation slide. I'm sorry, because indeed I have an issue with the arrow, which I didn't expect. Yes. Second slide on the recommendations, concrete proposals for how to expand the meaningful inclusion of young people in each of the political, economic, and social cultural spheres that are outlined in the study findings. So for that, member states and international and regional organizations should adopt and support the use of quotas. They should institutionalize measures to close the gap between youth population and the representation of youth in political institutions and processes at the local or national level. It means investing in the creation of safe community spaces for civic dialogue. It means engaging young people alongside community members in an assessment of their real economic needs before designing any type of interventions, and involving young people in the implementation, the monitoring, and the evaluation, in particular of employment programs, because we've seen that in the past that has not necessarily been the case. Investing in youth peace building work, focused on promoting also positive and equitable masculine identities that challenge the restrictive social norms that have really prevented the real gender equality. So that means also working with traditional and religious leaders in particular. It means also capitalizing on the role of education, formal and informal, as a tool for peace. Last but not least, some recommendations. So next slide. And I'm sorry because something is stuck on my computer. So the next slide, slide number 3, under recommendations, focusing on recommendations for building partnerships and collaborations at all levels, developing dialogue and consultation platforms for young people inside and outside of the UN. And that also means enhancing accountability. So among these recommendations, the importance of prioritizing the creation of youth, peace, and security coalitions to ensure the collective impact at all levels. There's some great work that has started even before the adoption of 2250 that certainly can be harnessed, but across the board we see a need to strengthen these coalitions and make them as coherent and as coordinated as possible. while preserving the grassroots nature of many of them. Consult and actively include young people in defining concrete objectives and global and country-specific indicators to be able to monitor progress and measure impact in the implementation of the Resolution 2250. It means also supportive qualitative and quantitative research and data collection on youth peace and security. I think we've clearly seen in the process of the development for the progress study that it's very hard sometimes to have quantitative data in particular, and there is generally a disconnect between the quantitative and the qualitative data that we're able to collect. Governments should undertake a review of the impact of their peace and security policies and practices on young people and make it mandatory for the security sector to consult with young people, and governments should also explore and ensure synergies with national plans to implement 1325 on women, peace and security. At the global level, of course, the UN system also should think about specific reforms, and the study is very already proposes a number of important changes or new mechanisms that could be put in place. Mentioned the importance of putting in place a tripartite monitoring structure to provide a common platform for member states, the UN, and young people to report regularly on the implementation of Resolution 2250. The creation of an informal expert group on youth, peace, and security composed of a diverse group of young people selected with youth organizations and that would be able to track a defined set of issues to mainstream the work or to mainstream youth, peace, and security work in the broader work of the Security Council. Making a priority of hearing directly from young people living in countries of the Security Council's agenda through standard briefings, ARIA formula meetings more systematically, including specific references to Resolution 2250 in the mandates and reports of peacekeeping and political missions, appointing an elected Security Council member to co-lead alongside a permanent one, the monitoring of progress of the implementation of the resolution, requesting the Secretary General to report annually to the Security Council on UN-wide efforts to implement Resolution 2250. So of course, these are all subject to decision by member states, but there are specific reforms that are being proposed in the UN in the independent progress study. Of course, if we are to work effectively in this as part of this agenda, the UN itself should also make some important reforms internally to beef up, boost our capacities to work on youth, peace, and security, to be able to effectively broaden the participation of young people. So some recommendations along those lines relate to making youth advisory boards and youth advisors a standard practice for UN country presence, in particular, placing youth advisors in lead offices of the UN, in executive offices, in the Secretariat or in specific entities, ensuring that we have dedicated capacities and expertise in place to meaningfully engage with young people and youth organizations, movements, and networks in the broader work on sustaining peace, which is very much connected to the 2250 agenda as well. And of course, developing a more specific roadmap on youth, peace, and security as part of the bigger effort to have a UN youth strategy, youth being amongst the top priorities in the UN and for the Secretary General in particular. So I will now perhaps say just a few words about the open debate that took place last week on the 23rd of April. Cécile mentioned it. It was the first ever open debate on youth, peace, and security hosted by Peru. And the session, we can safely say that it was a very successful open debate in the sense that clearly the narrative has evolved, clearly more member states are interested, and clearly there are already some practices and some initiatives that are being brought to the discussion that really connect some recommendations with the reality on the ground. So the open debate was, as I said, hosted by Peru, started with the presentation by 4 briefers, by Jayatma Vikramanayake, who is the SG's envoy on youth. She took the floor on behalf of the UN. And from the civil society side, we had Graham Simpson, the lead author of the Youth Peace and Security study, and 2 young briefers from civil society, 2 young women, for the first time, Sophia Pierre-Antoine from Haiti, and Kessie Ekomo-Soigné from Central African Republic. So more than 70 member states, all Security Council members, plus other member states under Rule 37 took the floor, the European Union, the Alliance of Civilization, and the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie under Rule 39 as observers also took the floor. 16 member states intervened at minister, deputy level, including several ministers of foreign affairs from Belgium, Croatia, Kenya, Maldives, Montenegro, Iceland, Poland, and Turkey. Romania also spoke as chair of the Peace Building Commission. It was a very, very long debate, very dense, and we can again say that it was really interesting to hear so many references to specific recommendations, so many references in particular to the importance of addressing stereotypes, of addressing assumptions, a clear recognition that so far youth was being seen through a specific lens that perhaps was not, clearly not tapping into their potential, and clearly not recognizing the rights of young people in a meaningful way. So it was a major shift. As I said, the role of the UN as well as the convener, the secretariat for the study, UNDP, other UN entities were mentioned, the UN Peace Building Fund, really highlighting, the thought leadership from the UN side, but also our convening power and brokering role in bringing different partners together. A reference was made also to several references actually to the Pathways for Peace UN World Bank report recently released in DC. Some of you may have participated in that. References to the Journey to Extremism report from UNDP that looked at the drivers leading to radicalization, leading to violent extremism, the work on Goal 16 in particular in the field, connecting the work between the work on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs with roadmaps or working groups on youth, peace, and security. So all in all, a very successful debate. And speaking now of next steps, there is a draft resolution being discussed at the moment being tabled by Peru and Sweden. Negotiations have started, and we will wait to hear about that. As I mentioned, the UN Youth Strategy is a top priority for the Secretary General. The idea is to bring together all the UN pillars, so including the youth, peace, and security agenda as part of that, with a critical emphasis on preventive measures, on the prevention work, and on the 2030 agenda. It's critical for us now to really look at improving our support to programming. The approach has to be holistic, has to be comprehensive. We need to be able to look at formal peace-building processes. We need to support youth civic engagement and political participation, continue supporting economic empowerment, but really looking beyond jobs and really looking at decent work for young people, and looking at the real needs that young people have when it comes to their economic life, but also when it comes to their sense of belonging, to their identity more broadly, and to their role in society. Emphasizing the role that young people play as agents of resilience and agents of peace is also critical. So that really requires overcoming a number of blockages and challenges. I will not go back to that. I mean, they're discussed at length in the progress study. Many of the findings relate specifically to those, and we simply have to make more conscious efforts to support the active involvement also of the most at-risk, marginalized, diverse young people, and not just in a way reinforce inequalities and stereotypes. So as I mentioned, yeah, important to have more coherent, comprehensive, and systematic support, more innovative thinking, more co-design with young people, acknowledging really the multidimensional needs that young people have, but more importantly, supporting their youth agency. We don't want to support just elite youth that would participate in conference. What we want is really making a difference in the field and having the ability to sustain that change as well, taking into account political dynamics, taking into account sensitivities, influencing also the prevention of violent extremism agenda, making sure that we do no harm, that we protect and promote the positive role of youth as well in this role. Same under the Sustaining Peace agenda, ensuring that young people are not just the recipients or the targets, but really are in the driving seat. So I think I would, on the improving the programming, aspects of it. I mean, that's all I would say for now, but we can engage in discussion. I will also mention that we're looking into supporting coalitions and partnerships in the field around youth peace and security, linking youth peace and security with the broader peace-building processes. We will be supporting the development of youth peace and security roadmaps. Some countries, Kenya for instance, in the open debate mentioned that they were developing their national action plan. Already Finland just announced the development also of a 20 to 50 national action plan with domestic and external measures as part of this plan. We will continue to invest in innovative research and looking into how we can collaboratively, really take a leap when it comes to data collection, data analysis, push for more disaggregation, so that we can really know what happens with youth well-being, what happens to young people in the context of peace building, and more importantly, try to measure their impact also on peace building. In terms of knowledge management, we have a very active community. We have the Youth for Peace Global platform that appears right now on the slide, youthforpeace.info. This is also the platform in which you can find all the background papers that led to the development of the progress study that fed into that amazing global research endeavor, and that Cécile also mentioned before. So inviting you to join this platform and to make it even more lively and dynamic. Feel free to share resources and flag any particular events that you would like to bring to our attention. This is really serving the work of the Youth Peace and Security working group. So strengthening the collaboration also with Youth Power Learning in particular is something that we will be more than happy to do. So really, here you have Cécile's contact, and here ours from UNDP side. As you mentioned, I manage the UNDP Youth Global Program, which supports youth civic engagement and political participation, youth economic empowerment, and the role of youth in peace building. But under this umbrella and in collaboration with this global program, we will also flesh out a number of interagency initiatives with UNFPA, with other UN entities looking at how to best advance this agenda. So if you have any questions, feel free. Thank you.
All right, that was great. Thank you so much, Cécile and Noëlla. This is Jen Heeg. So those of you who are part of the Youth Power, Youth and Peace and Security Community of Practice recognize me as a co-champ. I realize that my name doesn't make that clear in the little chat box. So I've been thanking people and welcoming people just to let you know. So I am part of the Youth Power Learning team. So for the Q&A, it looks like we have a few good questions coming in. Please feel free to keep them coming. The first two, actually, there was one from Casey and one from Hasna, and they're both related to gender. So I'll start with Casey's question. So what Casey asked was, are we still seeing programs unequally prioritized for young men? I have read that because of the focus on young women programs the past 10 years, that young men feel left out and marginalized, which has led to a thread of the violence causes. Do you agree with this?
I can start. Thanks. I think it's a. Noëlla, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
So I would just the Peace Building Support Office manages a fund called the Peace Building Fund, which supports peace building programs in 20-some countries, and we regularly do calls for proposals on youth and peace building. We've had two special calls for proposals in the past 2 years, and we're about to launch our third one. I would say, so just from my experience as advising the fund, there is definitely still, I think, a tendency in terms of peace building when designing programs about young people to de facto prioritize young men. So that's certainly true of programs that I've seen. So again, programs that have been proposals that have been given to the Peace Building Fund. Employment programs tend to be very often gender blind and or very gender stereotypical, where young women are going to be trained in traditional women's activities and occupations, while young men are going to be trained in more high tech, etc. So one of the ways we've tried to address that is to require for the proposals that we select that they are fully gender mainstreamed. And so in my experience, we've really had to work with the organizations that are applying to really push them to have a very strong gender perspective, gender analysis, and gender focus in their proposal. So I would say that, at least in my experience again, that we definitely see still a prioritization of young men. And often I would just say it's just a gender bias, meaning that it's not necessarily be thought through, that if you don't design your program in a way that is specifically thinking about how to reach out to young women, make sure they're involved, make sure they can access the program, that they won't be blocked by their families and their communities, etc., etc. So that's my experience. But Noëlla, I'm sure you have more to add.
No, I mean, completely agree with your point. I think there is partially it has to do, yes, with in a way the replication of similar types of programs. So sometimes it's just a lack of creativity and a lack of understanding of what gender dynamics might be, and some have to do also with more problematic, even bias, I would say. I've seen a number of proposals. I mean, they may not have directly resulted into projects or programs, but I think it still reveals a certain mindset. Some proposals that would, for instance, have an activity where young women are trained on gender-based violence in the context of peace building, and young men are supported to implement 20 to 50, for instance. That, to me, I think shows that there's still quite a lot of work to do. And of course, I mean, taking into consideration that we need safe spaces and inclusive spaces for young people to begin with, even more so when it comes to young women. I mean, I don't think that we can say that young men have been left out, but certainly we intend to include young men in conversations on gender equality.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And I think it actually feeds well into Hasna's question, which was the next one, which is more about actually engaging men and women, or young men and young women. So Hasna mentioned that Cécile talked about the de facto that most people who commit acts of terrorist violence are young men. And so what does that mean for using a peer-to-peer approach to engaging women to raise awareness about peace towards young men? So I think this is more about the actual interventions and how we would engage women if men are more likely to commit these acts.
If I may say on this point, I mean, perhaps there are various things in this comment and question that could be unpacked. One, it's true that there, in majority, the recruits in violent extremist groups are young people, or if you look at the average age, yes, they will be in their great majority young men. That doesn't mean that the majority, obviously, of young people or that of young men actually will be, interested in joining violent groups or interested in violence to begin with. That's the first thing that we just wanted to say. It's an important assumption being addressed in the study, so important to say that at the outset. Now, involving young women in addressing addressing violent extremism, or supporting the prevention of violent extremism, or supporting the prevention of violence, obviously is critical. And it's critical, I would say, not only in their role as sisters, mothers, and necessarily as part of traditional ways of looking at the role that women or young women might play in society. So just wanted to say these two things.
Yeah, and just to add from my side, just to flag something that I know we all agree on, the question of do no harm, and we've seen programs that want to enroll women or in young people as the frontliners of preventing and countering violent extremism, etc., that can also really put them at risk. So I think it's really important that as a community we just really keep the do no harm principle at the forefront, because again the threat and harassment that young people face is something that has come out so strongly from the research. So I just wanted to emphasize that point.
Thank you. I think that's really important, and I'm gonna go to Shelby's question, but first I'm gonna exercise 1 minute of moderator's privilege to kind of add on to what you said, because one part of the report, and this is a question for the moderator or for the presenters. One part of the report that really resonated with me as somebody who works in the Middle East and in Africa was this idea of policy panic around violent extremism, and kind of looking at youth solely through that lens of violent extremism. And I'm curious to know, the report, I think, was really inspiring how it was very clear about that. So I'm wondering, how can youth workers and youth organizations, further influence funders the way I'm hoping this report does, to affirm that the funding should be used for locally determined goals, and that maybe we should get over this policy panic a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's where a group like this one, just like the Working Group on Youth and Peace Building, that Search for Common Ground, UNOY, and PBSO are co-chairing, are really important, because that's really where we need to work together. What we tried to do with the study was to say, everyone tends to see, when we talk about peace and security, it's very different when we talk about development. But peace and security, young people immediately starts raising all these flags. And so we try to put the emphasis, you're not looking at what young people are doing because they're doing great, but they're doing great with very little, not enough funding, not enough visibility. They don't, very often youth organizations don't have the means to respond to donor requirements in terms of monitoring and evaluation, demonstrating the impact of their work, putting things in a beautiful results framework with well-defined outcome, outputs, and indicators. So I think there really is a responsibility on the side of organizations that have access to funders, the UN, the international NGOs, etc., to really advocate for the need for direct investment in youth-led organizations and youth-led initiatives related to peace and security, which is why we formulated a target, the 1.8 billion for young people in terms of peace and security, which really, when you look at what's spent in terms of CT and CVE or just military spending overall is very, very little. So I think there really needs to be, I mean, that's also why we emphasize the partnership approach, because organizations that have access need to be vocal to make sure that there are these investments in young people.
That's great.
And perhaps to add on the policy panic, if I may, specifically when it relates to strengthening linkages between youth, peace, and security, and youth and the prevention of violent extremism, we are in the process of finalizing a global report that precisely looks at that and strongly advocates for an investment in youth agency and in youth resilience also in addressing this particular issue that triggered so much policy panic as well, and that triggered an orientation of investment also towards a specific agenda. So we did focus group discussions in a number of countries and territories, and also a global survey that looks at perceptions as to whether we should be prioritizing the investment in youth organizations, or what the perceptions from youth and other stakeholders, in that case non-youth or adults from different organizations, actually think about that and how they put that into practice. So this report will come out later this month. So I hope we can also have an opportunity to present that and disseminate that.
You're always welcome here. I'm gonna we have 2 minutes left. I'm gonna ask Shelby's question, and then if we have time to stick around for a couple minutes, we got a flurry at the end, and I'm really interested in the Jin-In's questions as well. So Shelby asks, has there been any discussion or exploration around how youth participation in peace and security affects their personal experiences with violence? Are they receiving skills through participation that translates to their personal lives? Did the presenters hear that?
Yes, I'm just thinking about the question, and to me it's very much resonating with what. So when we met with young people everywhere, we asked them, what is peace and what is security for you? And it was, I found really interesting to see that, for it, and that's what we try to convey to the Security Council. What they see as peace and security is very different from what young people see, because they see it as something deeply personal, including being safe in the home and being safe in the streets. They really see the gender dimensions of peace. I mean, I also saw in the chat, there was a whole discussion around gender, and it was interesting to see that a lot of young men did speak about the specific threats and insecurity that young women face, again, at home and in the street. Which is not exactly a straightforward answer to your question. I mean, I don't have very specific examples to give, but from what, again, the discussions we had with young people, it certainly seemed that a lot of the work they were doing were also ways to deal with their own experience of violence and ways to be better equipped to deal, with trauma in their own lives.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would add that also being part of formal processes or formal decision making certainly has an impact on the way they also perceive, governance, the legitimacy of institutions, the efficiency of political processes. So I think that indirectly also has, of course, an impact on your own personal life, in addition to different skills that you may acquire for I don't know, to either start a business or develop your negotiation skills, basically. Yeah, so certainly has had an impact, but I would say that there is also another aspect to that question. It also had an impact on the way the rest of the community also at the personal level may have experienced a cycle of violence or a peace building process. I think witnessing the energy, the force, the resilience that young people bring to the table is something that can be life-changing also for others.
Absolutely. I think there are so many powerful examples even in the short paper. I'm really excited to see the longer version where we get into more of these details. And I think it would be good to close actually linking all this back to Jin'in's question, which is, are you or how are you working with the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which of course is the Women, Peace and Security?
So Resolution 1325 is, in a way, the big sister of Resolution 2250. And in the work that we did that led to the adoption of 2250, and in the work that happened after that, we've been in constant dialogue with the women, peace and security community to learn from them, from their experiences, from what has worked well or maybe not so well, etc. And I mean, what's interesting from the perspective of young people is that so clearly there is a really a great understanding of Resolution 1325. And also that what 2250 is bringing to it is a much stronger emphasis on age, because 1325 and the agenda on women, peace and security overall has really been about women. And if you look at the language, the policy language, it's actually all about the protection of women and girls and the participation of women, and not the participation of girls, because that remains such a challenging area for many member states. So that really is where the two agendas intersect. I mean, they're not two different agendas, they're fundamentally the same. It's about inclusivity, it's about participation of groups that typically do not participate, and it's about recognizing really particularly the agency and role of young women at the core of this. So the way we see it, youth, peace and security is it's fundamentally a gender agenda. It is part of women, peace and security. This is not separated. This is at the very heart of it. And again, that's what young people, the way they talk about it, and multiple identities, and it is at the very center of their experience.
Completely second that, and I would say there is a tremendous opportunity also with the emergence of an agenda that is perceived as being new and dynamic and really breaking new grounds, etc., to also rejuvenate some of the work that perhaps that perhaps would need it, or to connect also youth networks better with women networks, and I think that many practitioners working on women, peace and security for a long time have really welcomed this breath of fresh air from the youth, peace and security agenda, because there's so many intersections, and looking at masculinities, looking at gender-based violence, looking at political participation, there's so much that can be learned from both sides and from all sides.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time this morning and the great presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Maria to close us out today.
Great. Thank you, Jen. And thanks to our wonderful presenters. We really appreciate it. I know that we didn't get to all of the questions. We will post all the answers to the questions when we share the recordings. As you know, we are recording the webinar, and so we'll make that available together with the slides. So if we didn't get to your question, we will answer it later. And so just kind of briefly to close in terms of what you can do next, you can contribute to activities on Twitter under at YP Learning. You can join other communities of practice. Some of you seem to have a strong interest on gender topics, so we also have a gender community of practice. The Learning Hub, as I mentioned, send us materials or anything that you want us to post on youthpower.org, and we'll be happy to do so. And then last but not least, we have grants under contract. We just closed our most recent one, which was the Young Women Transform Prize in terms of the applications. So we'll be evaluating those and announce those sometime probably in the fall. But we do have a set of grants that have been awarded under the topic of youth civic engagement in effective peace building or encountering and prevention of violent extremism. And so the deliverables of those grants are coming out over the next few months. We will be sharing them with this community of practice, and we will also, of course, post the final materials. So we're very excited and looking forward to those. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for joining, and thanks again to our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so
It was a
much.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.